An elderly woman was cruelly abandoned in the forest by her own son. By a twist of fate, a millionaire happened upon her while she was lost and helpless. He was moved by her plight and decided to rescue her, completely changing the course of her life. What you're about to hear today might change the way you see things. But first, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the ending. The air in Asheville always carried a specific kind of quiet, the sort that settled in the bones of its older residents. Eleanor felt it as she watered her petunias on the porch of her craftsman bungalow, a home that had seen 72 years of her life. The Blue Ridge Mountains formed a gentle, hazy fortress around the town, a familiar sight she'd drawn comfort from since girlhood. Now they felt distant, watching. Inside, the silence was broken by the frantic rustle of papers and the low, guttural curse of her son Mark. At 45, his face was a roadmap of poor decisions, the lines around his eyes etched not by laughter, but by the strain of constant calculation. He was a handsome man, or had been, but now a perpetual storm cloud seemed to hang over him, leaching the color from his cheeks. "It's gone, Ma. All of it," he'd snarled an hour earlier, his voice trembling with a volatile mix of rage and desperation. The air still smelled of that confrontation, of old grief and fresh betrayal. "The money from Daddy's watch. And Nana's pearls?" Eleanor's voice had been a whisper, the words catching in her throat. The pearls were cool, milky memories against her skin, worn on her wedding day, her son's graduation. They were a tangible thread to a happier past, now severed. "You had no right, Mark. They were all I had left of them." "You have this house," he'd shot back, his eyes wild. "You have your pension. I have nothing but debts. You never understood the pressure. You never helped when I needed it." The accusation was an old, brittle weapon, one he'd wielded for years, blaming her for a life of his own making. The argument had ended not with a slam of the door, but with a chilling, calculated calm. "We need to get out," Mark had said, his voice flat. "A drive. Clear our heads." Now, the familiar streets of Asheville melted into winding roads that coiled like snakes up into the mountains. Eleanor sat stiffly in the passenger seat of her own sedan, her hands clasped in her lap. She wore a simple house dress and a thin cardigan, no match for the chill that was seeping into the car and her soul. The sun, which had been a gentle warmth in town, was now a sliver of orange caught between the darkening silhouettes of pine and poplar. Mark didn't speak. He drove with a grim purpose, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. When he finally pulled onto a gravel service road Eleanor had never seen, the last of the light was fading, painting the forest in shades of deep blue and bruised purple. "Where are we going, Mark?" she asked, her voice small. He stopped the car, the engine ticking as it cooled. The silence of the forest was immense, a living thing that pressed in on them. It was broken by the distant hoot of an owl, a sound that felt ancient and foreboding. "Get out," he said, not looking at her. Eleanor stared, uncomprehending. "Mark? Get out of the car, Eleanor." The use of her name, cold and formal, sent a spike of ice through her heart. "You can't be serious. It's getting dark. I have my arthritis. I'm not dressed for this." His head turned slowly, and in the dim dashboard light, she saw no trace of her little boy, only the hollowed-out man he had become. "Maybe the mountains will teach you what real hardship is, since you think mine are so trivial." With a terrifying mechanical efficiency, he got out, walked to her door, and opened it. He didn't yell. He simply took her by the arm, his grip bruising, and pulled her from the seat. Her purse, her phone, everything was left inside. She stumbled on the loose gravel, her ankles weak. "Mark, please," she cried, her voice cracking with a terror she hadn't known since her husband's funeral. "Don't do this!" He was already back in the driver's seat. The door slammed shut, a sound as final as a coffin lid. The headlights illuminated her, a frail figure in a vast, dark wilderness. The car reversed, tires spitting stones, then turned and sped away, its red taillights disappearing into the tunnel of trees until there was nothing left but the encroaching night and the echo of the engine. The darkness was absolute. The gentle mountains of her youth had transformed into a jagged, breathing entity. Every rustle in the undergrowth was a predator, every creak of a branch a threat. The cold bit through her cardigan, and a profound, shivering loneliness gripped her. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone, but as her eyes adjusted to the gloom, a flicker of defiance, faint as a dying ember, sparked within her. She would not just lie down and die. She took a shaky step, then another, guided by a sliver of moonlight. It was then her foot caught on something solid and metallic, half buried in the leaf litter, something that felt unnaturally smooth and cold, something that had no business being in this forgotten part of the woods. The first light of dawn was a pale, forgiving gold, painting the mist that clung to the peaks of the Blue Ridge. Robert Vance stood on a rocky outcrop, his hands shoved into the pockets of his expensive but practical outdoor jacket. Below him, the forest was a sea of deep green, untouched and serene. He was here to survey this vast tract of land, a potential site for the Eleanor Vance Center for Rare Neurological Diseases, named for the mother he had lost too soon. The irony of being in these mountains, so far from Seattle, on a mission born entirely of his own grief, was not lost on him. The quiet of Asheville was different from the urban hum of home. It was a silence that felt heavy with stories. He decided to walk the perimeter of the proposed site before his team arrived, needing the solitude. The air was crisp, clean, and carried the scent of damp earth and pine. He followed a deer trail, his mind occupied with architectural plans and fundraising goals, a familiar armor against the dull, persistent ache of memory. His mother had had the same gentle strength he associated with these old mountains. Losing her had carved a hollow in him that no amount of wealth or philanthropy could ever truly fill. It was a sound that broke his reverie, so faint he almost dismissed it as the wind. But it came again, a low, broken whimper, the sound of utter exhaustion. Robert froze, his senses sharpening. He moved toward the sound, his boots silent on the thick carpet of moss and fallen leaves. He found her nestled in the exposed roots of a massive, ancient oak, as if the tree itself had tried to shelter her. She was a small, crumpled form in a thin cardigan, her skin pale and clammy. Her eyes were half closed, her breathing shallow. For a terrifying second, his heart seized, a ghost from his past superimposing itself over the scene. But this wasn't his mother. This was another woman, left to the mercy of the wilderness. "Hey," he said, his voice soft and low, not wanting to startle her. He knelt, the damp earth immediately soaking into the knees of his trousers. "Can you hear me?" Eleanor's eyelids fluttered. She tried to focus, her mind swimming in a haze of cold and fear. She saw a man, not her son. A stranger with a face etched with concern, not malice. Robert's compassion was instantaneous, a visceral reaction dredged from the depths of his own loss. The sight of this vulnerable, abandoned woman shattered his billionaire's detachment. He unslung his backpack and retrieved a bottle of water. "I've got some water for you. It's okay. You're safe now." He gently supported her head, his touch firm yet tender, and brought the bottle to her lips. She drank in small, desperate sips, the water trickling down her chin. A little life seemed to return to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, the words a dry rasp. "My son. He left me." The statement, delivered with such shattered simplicity, sent a jolt of cold fury through Robert. He pushed it down. Now was not the time for anger. "He won't hurt you anymore," Robert said, his voice unwavering. "My name is Robert. I'm going to get you out of here. You're going to be just fine." He shrugged off his jacket and wrapped it around her frail shoulders, enveloping her in its warmth. He called 911, his voice calm and authoritative as he relayed their rough location. While they waited, he stayed kneeling beside her, offering sips of water and words of reassurance, creating a small island of safety in the vast, uncaring forest. He learned her name was Eleanor, and the coincidence felt less like chance and more like fate. As the distant wail of sirens began to weave their way up the mountain road, a new strength seemed to settle in Eleanor's frail body. She looked at Robert, her gaze clearing, the fog of shock and dehydration lifting to reveal a core of hardened steel. She reached out a trembling hand and clutched his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "Robert," she said, her voice no longer a whisper, but low and resolute. "He took everything from me, my past, my security." She paused, her eyes locking with his, blazing with a fire he wouldn't have thought possible minutes ago. "But I know something he doesn't think I know. It's about what he's really involved in. It's not just debts. It's much, much worse, and I want to make him pay. The wail of sirens grew from a distant promise to a piercing reality, cutting through the mountain silence. Paramedics, efficient and gentle, swaddled Eleanor in warm blankets and began their initial assessment. Robert gave a terse, grim statement to the sheriff's deputy who arrived with them, his voice tight with controlled anger as he relayed what Eleanor had told him. He made it clear he would be following the ambulance to the hospital. At the Asheville Memorial Emergency Room, amidst the sterile smell of antiseptic and the low hum of fluorescent lights, Eleanor was treated for dehydration and exposure. Robert never left the waiting area, his presence a stark contrast to the frantic energy of the ER. He made calls, his voice a low, commanding murmur, rearranging his multi-billion-dollar schedule with a few terse sentences. His focus had narrowed to a single unwavering point, the woman named Eleanor. Once she was stabilized, he intervened. With a quiet authority that bypassed bureaucracy, he arranged for her discharge into his care. "She'll have private, round-the-clock medical attention," he told the attending physician, his tone leaving no room for argument. He couldn't bear the thought of her in a sterile, impersonal hospital room, a symbol of further institutional neglect. His temporary residence in Asheville was not a hotel suite, but a sprawling, secluded mountain lodge made of timber and glass, perched on a crest with panoramic views of the very mountains that had nearly claimed her life. He brought her there as the afternoon sun cast long, gentle shadows. The place was furnished in understated luxury: plush leather sofas, a massive stone fireplace, Navajo rugs on polished hardwood floors. It was a sanctuary of warmth and quiet. Robert's personal physician, Dr. Evans, a serious man who had flown in from Seattle, was waiting. He conducted a thorough examination in one of the guest rooms while Robert waited outside, pacing the long hallway. Finally, Dr. Evans emerged. "She's a remarkably resilient woman, Mr. Vance," he said, closing his medical bag. "The primary concerns are malnutrition and the early stages of hypothermia. Her body has been under significant strain, both physically and emotionally. What she needs most now is rest, consistent, nutritious meals, and above all, a profound sense of security." Robert nodded, the words cementing his resolve. He entered the room quietly. Eleanor was propped up against a mountain of pillows, dwarfed by the large bed. She looked small and fragile, but her eyes, now clear and alert, tracked his movement with a wariness that spoke of a lifetime of disappointments. "The doctor says you're going to be fine," Robert said, pulling a wingback chair close to the bed. "We'll make sure you have everything you need." Eleanor's gaze was cautious, scanning his face as if looking for the catch, the hidden angle. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked, her voice still weak but laced with a pragmatic suspicion born of hardship. "You don't know me. All of this," she gestured weakly at the opulent room. "It's too much." Robert leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his expression open and earnest. "I lost my mother 2 years ago," he said, the confession simple and stark. "Her name was Eleanor, too. I wasn't there for her at the end the way I should have been. I was building all of this." He waved a hand, dismissing his empire with a flick of his wrist. "When I found you in those woods, it felt like a second chance. I can't help her anymore, but I can help you." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, not of self-pity, but of a stunned, disbelieving gratitude. The hardened shell of her suspicion began to crack. Seeing her emotion, Robert's voice softened further, becoming a solemn vow. He reached out and gently covered her thin, veined hand with his own. "Listen to me, Eleanor. What happened to you? It ends now. You will never be abandoned again. You will never be alone again. You have a home here for as long as you want it. That is my promise to you." The words hung in the quiet room, not as a hollow comfort, but as a bedrock truth. Eleanor looked at their joined hands, then back at his face, and gave a slow, tremulous nod. For the first time in years, a flicker of something like hope began to warm the cold, hollow places inside her. She took a shaky breath, the weight of her ordeal and the shock of this unexpected salvation pressing down on her. "Robert," she began, her voice gaining a sliver of its former strength, a steel wire running through the fatigue. "What I started to tell you on the mountain, about my son, it's not just gambling debts. He's mixed up with people, dangerous people. He was their courier, using my late husband's old car for their deliveries. I found a ledger, a small black book, hidden in the spare tire well. I didn't know what it was, not then. I hid it for safekeeping, thinking it was one of his silly schemes. She met his gaze, her eyes filled with a terrifying clarity. If they find out he's lost it or that I know, they'll kill him, and they won't stop there. The silence in Mark's rented trailer was different from the quiet of his mother's porch. This was a hollow, ringing silence, punctuated only by the frantic thumping of his own heart and the occasional drip from the kitchen faucet. The adrenaline and cheap whiskey that had fueled his monstrous decision had long since evaporated, leaving behind the cold, leaden sludge of regret and pure, undiluted terror. He'd driven back down the mountain in a blind panic, his mind replaying the image of his mother, so small, so frail, swallowed by the encroaching dark. What had he done? He was a failure, a disappointment, but he had never been a monster. Until now, he was on his third cup of bitter black coffee, his hands shaking so badly the liquid sloshed over the rim. When a car pulled up outside, not the rusted-out sedan of a loan shark's enforcer, but a sleek, pearl-white BMW that looked profoundly out of place in the gravel and weeds lot. The doors opened in unison, and a couple stepped out, their movements synchronized and efficient. They were dressed in crisp, business-casual attire, their smiles polished and professional, but their eyes scanned the dilapidated surroundings with a sharp, analytical gleam. Mark watched them approach, a fresh wave of panic seizing him. Had they found him? Were they here about the money? He considered bolting out the back, but it was too late. A confident knock echoed through the flimsy trailer door. Hesitantly, he opened it a crack. "Yeah, Mark Vance?" the man said. He was handsome in a generic television anchor way, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a jawline that could cut glass. "I'm Chad Sterling. This is my wife and partner, Brittany Sterling. We're attorneys. We'd like to talk to you about your mother." The words hit Mark like a physical blow. They knew. How could they possibly know? He stammered, I don't have money for lawyers." Brittany Sterling stepped forward, her smile a masterpiece of calculated warmth. She was a sharp contrast to her husband, with dark, intelligent eyes and a penetrating gaze that seemed to take inventory of every crack in the wall and every flaw in Mark's character. "Oh, Mark, you misunderstand. We're not here for your money. We're here about the money that's being stolen from your family, from you." Confused and vulnerable, Mark let them in. The Sterlings made the cramped trailer feel even smaller, their presence an intrusion of a different, more sophisticated world. Chad took the lead, his voice a smooth, reassuring baritone. "We've been following the news. A local woman, Eleanor Vance, was found in a state of distress on the mountain by a billionaire named Robert Vance. Sound familiar?" Mark could only nod, his throat tight. "Now he's taken her to his private compound," Chad continued, leaning forward conspiratorially. "He's isolated her, cut her off from her family, her only son. Does that sound like a rescue to you, Mark? Or does it sound like the first step in a very sophisticated form of elder abuse?" The phrase elder abuse landed with the force of a sledgehammer, reframing the entire horrific situation. Mark's own guilt was suddenly offered a convenient, external target. Abuse? But he found her. He saved her, did he? Brittany interjected, her voice softer but laced with steel. Or did he orchestrate an opportunity? A vulnerable, confused elderly woman with a known troubled son? It's the perfect scenario. He gets to play the hero for the press while he exerts undue influence. We've seen this before, Mark. He'll get her to sign over power of attorney. He'll gain control of her assets, this house you mentioned, her pension. He's not a good Samaritan. He's a predator. They were weaving a tapestry of lies, but they used the threads of Mark's own guilt and fear. They were offering him a lifeline, a way to be the hero who saved his mother from a different monster, thereby absolving himself of his own monstrous act. They played on his desperation, his naivete, his longing for a simple solution to the catastrophic mess he had created. "We can help you," Chad said, his tone becoming grave. "We can file an emergency injunction for custodial interference. We can expose Robert Vance for what he is and bring your mother home, where she belongs. But we need to act fast. The retainer—" Mark mumbled, the old, familiar dread returning. Brittany waved a dismissive hand. We work on a specialized contract for cases like this. High profile, high stakes. We front all the costs, the filings, the private investigators, the expert witnesses. You only reimburse our expenses and a success fee upon the favorable resolution of the case and the recovery of your mother's assets. She made it sound so reasonable, so risk-free. Chad produced a thick document from his leather portfolio. The text was dense, the legalese impenetrable. This just formalizes our partnership, Mark. It says we're in this together. Mark's eyes glazed over. He saw bolded numbers, $950 an hour for Chad, $850 for Brittany, plus a 35% fee of the total value of any recovered or preserved assets. But the sheer scale of the figures didn't fully register. All he saw was a way out, a chance to fix what he had broken, to be the son he should have been. The Sterlings watched him, their expressions a perfect mask of supportive concern. His hand was still trembling as he took the proffered pen. He didn't see the predatory glint in Brittany's eyes as she watched him, or the subtle, triumphant glance she exchanged with her husband. He scrawled his signature at the bottom of the last page, the ink a messy confession of his own desperation. Chad smoothly retrieved the contract, tucking it safely away. "Welcome to the fight, Mark. We'll take it from here." As they stood to leave, Brittany paused at the door, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "Get some rest, Mark. You've done the right thing. The hard part is over." The moment the BMW pulled away, a cold knot tightened in Mark's stomach. The intoxicating rush of having a plan, of fighting back, began to recede, replaced by a gnawing, primal doubt. He looked down at his hand, still smudged with ink, and the silence of the trailer was no longer just hollow. It was waiting. He had just declared war on a billionaire, and the first, most crucial battle line had been drawn not in a courtroom, but in the fine print of a contract he hadn't even read, signed with a pen that felt more and more like it had signed away his soul. He was now entangled in a web far more dangerous than the one he'd been in before, and the architects of that web were now his legal representatives. The storm broke not with thunder, but with the crisp sound of a legal filing landing on the polished mahogany desk of Robert's temporary Asheville office. The Sterling Group, on behalf of their client Mark Vance, had petitioned the court for an emergency order granting Mark full custody of his mother, Eleanor Vance. The document was a masterpiece of malicious fiction. It painted Robert as a predatory opportunist who had isolated a vulnerable senior following a suspicious and poorly explained traumatic event, alleging he was exerting undue influence to gain control of her modest but significant assets. It was a narrative built on half-truths and outright lies, but it was a narrative that was dangerously easy to sell. Chad and Brittany Sterling were not just attorneys. They were architects of perception. They knew the law was a slow, grinding machine, but the court of public opinion was a swift and brutal beast. Before Robert's legal team could even draft a formal response, the Sterlings held a press conference on the steps of the Buncombe County Courthouse. Brittany, with her sharp, intelligent eyes and sober expression, spoke into a thicket of microphones. "This is a classic case of a wolf in sheep's clothing," she declared, her voice ringing with feigned outrage. A billionaire swoops in, seizes a moment of family tragedy, and isolates a confused and grieving elderly woman from her only son. He has cut off all communication. He has barred Mr. Vance from seeing his own mother. We are here today to ask, what does Robert Vance truly want with Eleanor Vance? It certainly isn't her well-being. The story was catnip for the 24-hour news cycle. Sensationalist headlines bloomed across cable news chyrons and online tabloids. Billionaire hero or predator, and mystery mountain rescue now a custody battle. Talking heads debated the ethics of billionaire philanthropy, subtly implying Robert's entire charitable foundation was a front for more sinister motives. Grainy, unflattering photos of Robert, taken from his most intense corporate takeovers, were juxtaposed with a decades-old smiling portrait of Eleanor from the local paper. The narrative was set: the cold, calculating titan of industry versus the sweet, helpless grandmother. Inside the serene confines of the mountain lodge, the digital tempest felt a world away, until it didn't. Robert's head of security handed him a tablet, the screen filled with the venomous headlines. A cold fury settled in Robert's gut. It was one thing to come after him. He was used to the slings and arrows of corporate warfare. It was another to weaponize a fragile woman's trauma and paint him as the villain in a story where he had only tried to do good. He was forced to respond. His PR team back in Seattle urged a cautious, legalistic statement. Robert overruled them. Standing on the lodge's sprawling deck with the very mountains that had started it all as his backdrop, he faced a smaller, curated group of reporters. His voice was calm, but his jaw was tight. "The allegations against me are categorically false and deeply offensive," he stated, his gaze steady. "I found Mrs. Vance abandoned and near death. My only intention was, and remains, to ensure her safety and her health. She is recovering from a profound trauma inflicted upon her by the very person now petitioning for custody. I will not stand by while she is re-victimized by a cynical legal maneuver designed to distract from a criminal act." His words were strong, but the Sterling's narrative had already taken root. The question thrown back at him, "If you have nothing to hide, Mr. Vance, why not allow her son to visit?" was a trap, and he knew it. Allowing Mark access could endanger Eleanor, but denying it played perfectly into the Sterling's hands. Eleanor, meanwhile, watched the news coverage from the living room sofa, wrapped in a thick blanket. The color drained from her face as she saw her son's manipulated, sorrowful image on the screen and heard the word custody used as if she were a child. A profound anguish gripped her. This was her fault. Her survival had unleashed this chaos, tarnishing the name of the one person who had shown her unconditional kindness. "I should just go back," she whispered to Robert when he returned inside, her voice thick with tears. "I can't let them do this to you. I'll tell them I'm fine, that it was all a misunderstanding." Robert knelt before her, his expression fierce with protectiveness. "Eleanor, look at me. You are not a burden. This is not your fault. This is what they do. They twist the truth to serve their own ends. Going back to him is exactly what they want, and it is the most dangerous thing you could do." He took her hand. "We have the truth on our side, and we have the ledger." The mention of the ledger was a jolt. It was their secret, the one piece of hard evidence she had withheld from everyone, even the sheriff's deputies, only confiding in Robert. It was the key, she was sure, to the real danger Mark was in. "But the lawyer on the television said they're asking the judge to order a psychiatric evaluation," Eleanor said, a fresh wave of shame washing over her. "To prove I'm incompetent, that I'm confused." "Let them," Robert said, his voice softening. "Dr. Evans's reports are impeccable. You are of sound mind and you are a victim. We will prove that," he squeezed her hand. "But we need to be smart. We need to know what we're truly facing. The hearing is in 48 hours. We need to understand what's in that ledger, not just for our case, but for Mark's safety. My head of security, David, is the best. He can have it deciphered quietly. We need to know who we're up against." Eleanor looked from Robert's determined face to the tranquil, misty mountains beyond the glass, now a symbol of both her terror and her salvation. She had survived the wilderness, but the courtroom and the court of public opinion were a different kind of jungle. She nodded slowly, the fear in her eyes hardening into resolve. She reached into the small hidden pocket of the bag one of Robert's assistants had retrieved from her bungalow and pulled out a small, worn, black notebook, its pages filled with cryptic symbols and initials that held the power to shatter her son's world, and perhaps save him from it. The air in the Asheville courthouse was thick with the scent of old wood and anxious anticipation. The small gallery was packed, a mix of local reporters, curious townsfolk, and a few stern-faced individuals whose expensive suits marked them as Robert's observers. On one side of the courtroom sat Mark, flanked by Chad and Brittany Sterling, who looked every bit the picture of righteous advocates. On the other, Eleanor sat beside Robert, her posture regal despite her frailty, her hand resting on his arm for strength. Behind them sat Robert's lead attorney, a compact, sharp-eyed woman named Sarah Jenkins, whose reputation for dismantling opponents was legendary in Seattle legal circles. Judge Harriet Walker, a woman with a steely gaze and a no-nonsense demeanor, called the court to order. The Sterling's petition for emergency custody was the first order of business. Chad Sterling stood, smoothing his tie, and launched into his opening statement with theatrical gravitas. "Your Honor, we are here today to rescue a mother from the clutches of a manipulative stranger," he began, his voice echoing in the quiet room. He painted a picture of a confused, grieving woman, preyed upon by a billionaire with inscrutable motives. He spoke of isolation, of severed family ties, of the suspicious circumstances of the rescue. It was a performance designed to sway, not with facts, but with emotion. When it was her turn, Sarah Jenkins stood slowly. She didn't approach the jury box. She simply placed her hands on the table and spoke in a calm, clear, conversational tone that commanded the room more effectively than Chad's projection ever could. "Your Honor, opposing counsel has presented a compelling fiction," she said, a faint, almost pitying smile on her lips. "But that's all it is, fiction. The truth is far simpler and far more tragic. My client, Robert Vance, saved Eleanor Vance's life after she was criminally abandoned to die by her own son. The only undue influence being exerted in this case is the financial and psychological coercion being practiced by Mr. and Mrs. Sterling upon their own client, Mark Vance." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Chad Sterling shot to his feet. "Objection!" Speculation and baseless accusation. "Sustained," Judge Walker said, though her eyes remained fixed on Sarah with keen interest. "Counselor, you will present evidence for these claims." "Gladly, Your Honor," Sarah said. She turned and nodded to a paralegal. "Let's start with the foundation of the Sterlings' relationship with their client, the contract." She entered into evidence a copy of the contract Mark had signed. On a large screen, the dense document was displayed for the court. Sarah then played an audio recording. The voices of Chad and Brittany were crisp and clear, their polished tones now dripping with condescension. The retainer. Mark's hesitant voice mumbled from the speakers. Brittany's voice, smooth as silk, responded, "We work on a specialized contract. You only reimburse our expenses and a success fee upon the favorable resolution of the case and the recovery of your mother's assets." Chad's voice added, "This just formalizes our partnership, Mark. It says we're in this together." Sarah paused the recording. "Partnership, Your Honor? A curious term for an attorney-client relationship." She then highlighted sections of the contract on the screen. The $950 an hour fee, the 35% success fee of all recovered or preserved assets. This is not a standard retainer agreement. This is a contingency fee on steroids, explicitly tied to the seizure of an elderly woman's home and pension. It creates a direct financial incentive for the Sterlings to keep Eleanor Vance away from my client, not because it's in her best interest, but because it's in their best interest. They aren't seeking to reunite a family. They are seeking to liquidate an estate. Brittany Sterling's face was a mask of cold fury, but a flicker of unease was in her eyes. Chad began objecting again, his voice losing its smooth composure. Sarah then called her first witness, a private investigator. He testified to having documented multiple meetings between the Sterlings and a known local loan shark, a man named Leo the Weasel Ferraro, both before and after they approached Mark. He presented time-stamped photos. "And what is Mr. Ferraro's profession?" Sarah asked. "He's a high-interest lender and an enforcer, ma'am. Notorious for strong-arm tactics." So, the very people who claimed to be saving Mark Vance from a predatory billionaire were in bed with the actual predators who were threatening him? Sarah summarized. The gallery erupted and the judge's gavel cracked down. The final devastating blow came from an unexpected source. Sarah called an elderly, nervous-looking man named Mr. Abernathy, the owner of the trailer park where Mark lived. "I was fixin' a leak under the trailer next to Mr. Vance's," he stammered, under oath. "I heard him talking through the floor vents, plain as day." "The lady lawyer," she said, "the old bat's survival is a complication, but it's also an opportunity. We can use the son's guilt to control the narrative." "And the fella?" He laughed and said, "By the time we're done, Vance will be funding our new vacation home in the Bahamas. I didn't think nothing of it till I saw all this on the news." The revelation was a bomb. The Sterlings' carefully constructed facade shattered into a million pieces. They weren't just aggressive lawyers. They were con artists who had seen a desperate man and a tragic situation as a payday. Mark, sitting beside them, had gone ashen. He stared at the table, the full, horrifying weight of his mistake crashing down on him. He had traded one monster for two far more sophisticated ones. Judge Walker's face was granite. "Counselor Sterling, consider your law licenses under immediate review by the State Bar. This petition for custody is denied with prejudice." She then turned to the sheriff's deputy at the door. "Place Chad and Brittany Sterling under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and attempted elder abuse." As the cuffs clicked shut on the stunned couple, the courtroom descended into chaos. Reporters scrambled for the door. But amidst the uproar, Sarah Jenkins leaned over and whispered to Robert and Eleanor, her expression grimly satisfied but urgent. "This part is over. We've exposed the puppeteers, but we still have the puppet, and more importantly, we have the reason the puppeteers were so interested in the first place." She looked directly at Eleanor. "The ledger, Mrs. Vance. The real fight is just beginning. The people Mark was running from now know their secrets are in the open. They will be coming." The gavel's crack was like a gunshot, silencing the chaotic aftermath of the Sterling's arrest. As the disgraced attorneys were led away in handcuffs, their carefully constructed world of lies evaporating around them, a different kind of storm was brewing at the plaintiff's table. Mark Vance sat utterly alone, the chair beside him now a gaping void. The spectacle had stripped him of his last defenses. The grandiose plan to be the hero, the narrative of saving his mother from a predator, it had all been a script written by con artists, and he had been their willing, foolish actor. The weight of his own actions, no longer diluted by their poisonous justification, crashed down upon him with the force of a landslide. He was sobbing, great, heaving sobs that racked his entire body. His shoulders shook, and he buried his face in his hands, but there was no hiding the sound of his utter disintegration. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with the energy of a scandal, fell into a stunned, respectful hush. All eyes were on the broken man. Judge Walker, her expression no longer just stern, but touched with a weary pity, watched him for a long moment. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice lower, quieter than it had been all morning. "This court has just witnessed a profound miscarriage of justice, orchestrated by the individuals you entrusted with your case. But the petition before me, at its core, still bears your name. Is there anything you wish to say before I render a final disposition on these custody proceedings?" Mark didn't seem to hear her at first, lost in the private hell of his remorse. Robert's attorney, Sarah Jenkins, watched him closely, her litigator's gaze analytical, but not unkind. Robert himself had placed a protective arm around Eleanor's shoulders, feeling her tremble as she watched her son come apart. Then Mark lifted his head. His face was a ravaged landscape of tears and snot, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate. He looked not at the judge, but across the room at his mother. "I'm sorry," he choked out, the words thick and ragged. "Mom, I'm so sorry." The dam broke. The confession poured out of him, a torrent of shame and long-suppressed truth. He spoke of the gambling, starting with casual poker games and escalating into a bottomless pit of online sports betting and backroom blackjack. He described the terrifying spiral, the initial wins, the devastating losses, the borrowed money, the threats. He named Leo the Weasel Ferraro, his voice trembling as he described the man's cold eyes and the promises of broken bones. "I sold Daddy's watch," he wept, the admission of physical pain. "I sold Nana's pearls. I sold every piece of our family I could get my hands on. And it was never enough. The hole just got deeper and deeper." He finally dragged his gaze from Eleanor to the judge, his expression one of pure, unvarnished self-loathing. "That night, on the mountain, I wasn't thinking. I was just terrified. Of them, of myself, of what I'd become. I thought, I don't know what I thought, that if she was gone, the problem would be gone, that I could run. It was the most monstrous, cowardly—" His words failed him again, lost in another wave of sobs. He turned back to Eleanor, his eyes pleading for an understanding he knew he did not deserve. "I left you there to die. My own mother. I don't expect you to ever forgive me. I don't deserve to be forgiven. I need you to know that I am sorry. For all of it. For every lie, every stolen heirloom, every hurtful word. For not being the son you raised me to be." A single silent tear traced a path down Eleanor's wrinkled cheek, then another. The courtroom was a cathedral of silence, bearing witness to this raw human wreckage. Robert's grip on her shoulder tightened, a silent anchor. Then Eleanor slowly, deliberately stood up. She gently shrugged off Robert's arm and walked around the table, her simple house dress and cardigan a stark contrast to the formal wood-paneled room. She didn't hurry. Each step was measured, a journey of its own. She walked until she was standing before her weeping son. He couldn't meet her eyes, his head hung in shame. "Look at me, Mark," she said, her voice soft but clear, carrying to every corner of the wrapped courtroom. He forced himself to look up, his face a mask of agony. Eleanor reached out a frail, trembling hand and cupped his wet cheek. Her touch was gentle, a balm on a festering wound. "A mother's love isn't a prize you earn for good behavior," she said, her own tears now flowing freely. "It's a promise you make the first time you hold your child. It's a bond that doesn't break, even when people do." She took a shaky breath, her voice strengthening with a conviction that came from the deepest part of her soul. "You have done a terrible thing, a heartbreaking thing. You have a long, hard road ahead to ever forgive yourself. But you are my son. You are my little boy, and I forgive you." A collective, quiet gasp rippled through the room. It was not an absolution of his actions, but a liberation of his soul from her anger. It was a grace so profound it was almost unbearable to witness. Mark crumbled. He fell forward, burying his face in her stomach, his arms wrapping around her waist as he wept like the child he once was. Eleanor held him, her hands stroking his hair, her own tears falling onto his head. It was a tableau of devastating beauty, the ultimate unconditional love facing down the ultimate betrayal and choosing mercy. Judge Walker, visibly moved, cleared her throat after a long moment. "The petition for custody is permanently dismissed," she declared, her voice husky. "Mr. Vance, you will remain in the custody of the sheriff, pending formal charges for your actions on the mountain. The court will, however, take your cooperation and this extraordinary display of contrition into account." As bailiffs moved to lead a broken but somehow lighter Mark away, he looked back at his mother one last time, his eyes filled with a grief that was now clean, no longer poisoned by lies. Robert watched the scene, his own heart aching with a complex mix of emotions. He had won. The immediate legal threat was obliterated. But as he looked at Eleanor, who stood alone now, swaying slightly from the emotional tempest, he knew the victory was fragile. The ledger, the real threat, still loomed. Mark's public confession had not just been a catharsis for a broken family. It had been a broadcast to every dangerous ear listening. He had named Leo Ferraro in open court. He had confirmed the existence of secrets worth killing for. The Sterlings had been the obvious snakes in the grass. But now, the true wolves would be stirring, and they would be coming for the ledger and for anyone who knew what it contained. The gavel's final crack was a period at the end of a sentence of lies. Judge Harriet Walker's voice, firm and resonant, filled the now silent courtroom. "Chad and Brittany Sterling, your manipulation of this court and your predatory exploitation of a vulnerable man for financial gain is an egregious violation of your oaths. You are remanded into custody without bail, pending trial on multiple counts of conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted elder abuse, and perjury. The North Carolina State Bar will be notified before the end of today." As the deputies led the Sterlings away, Chad's polished facade had crumbled into stunned silence, while Brittany shot a single, venomous glare back at the courtroom, a look that promised this wasn't over, but was rendered impotent by the cold reality of the handcuffs around her wrists. The puppeteers had been pulled from their stage. All eyes then turned to Mark. He sat alone, hollowed out by his public confession, his body trembling with the aftershocks of raw, unburdened truth. He looked like a man waiting for a sentence he knew he deserved. Judge Walker's gaze upon him was stern, but not without a trace of measured compassion. "Mr. Vance, your actions on that mountain were abhorrent. They were criminal, and you will be held accountable for them." She paused, letting the weight of the words settle. However, this court has also witnessed a level of contrition that is rare and, I believe, genuine. You have taken the first, most difficult step by speaking the truth, unprompted and under oath. She shifted her attention to Eleanor and Robert. The court's primary concern is, and must always be, the welfare and safety of Eleanor Vance. Based on the evidence presented, including the criminal abandonment by her son, the predatory actions of the Sterlings, and the stable, secure, and compassionate environment provided by Robert Vance, I am granting temporary legal custody of Eleanor Vance to Mr. Robert Vance for a period of 6 months. Subject to review? A palpable wave of relief washed over Robert. He felt Eleanor's hand tighten on his arm, not in fear, but in gratitude. The judge continued, her words carefully chosen. "Mr. Vance," she said, addressing Mark again, "this custody order is not a termination of your relationship with your mother. It is a protection for her. Therefore, the court will allow for the possibility of supervised visitation. This is contingent upon 2 non-negotiable conditions. First, you must enroll in and demonstrate consistent participation in a court-approved inpatient treatment program for gambling addiction. Second, you must remain sober. Any violation of these terms will result in the immediate revocation of visitation rights. Do you understand?" Mark looked up, his eyes glistening with a mixture of shame and a fragile, newfound hope. He nodded, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Yes, Your Honor, thank you." It wasn't freedom, but it was a path. A narrow, difficult one, but it was more than he had allowed himself to hope for an hour ago. As the court adjourned and the room began to empty, a quiet sense of justice settled over the protagonists. The immediate grotesque threat had been neutralized. The law had seen through the deception and had acted to shield the innocent. Robert helped Eleanor to her feet, her body leaning into his support. "It's over," Eleanor whispered, her voice thick with exhaustion. "This part is," Robert replied softly, his gaze scanning the departing crowd. He saw the reporters already on their phones, crafting the next headline. He saw the sheriff's deputies leading a resigned Mark through a side door. The legal battle was won, but the victory felt precarious. The Sterlings were in custody, but they were a symptom, not the disease. They had been drawn to the scent of money and desperation around Mark, a desperation fueled by far more dangerous men. As they stepped out of the courthouse into the crisp Asheville afternoon, the sun felt warm on their faces. For a moment, it was just the 2 of them, standing together in the light. But the shadow of the ledger, that small black book filled with cryptic secrets, lay between them, an unspoken truth. They had exposed the con artists in the courtroom, but in doing so, they had undoubtedly alerted the real criminals, the ones Mark was so terrified of, that their operations were compromised. The quiet of the mountains no longer felt like a sanctuary, but like the calm before a storm. The fight for Eleanor's safety had evolved. It was no longer about custody, but about survival. The victory from the courtroom was short-lived, a fleeting moment of sunshine before the clouds of a far more dire crisis gathered. The immense stress of the ordeal, the abandonment, the legal battle, the emotional tsunami of Mark's confession had exacted a terrible toll on Eleanor's frail body. What began as fatigue and a slight yellowing of her eyes swiftly escalated into a medical emergency. She was rushed to the prestigious Emory University Hospital in Atlanta, where a team of specialists delivered a devastating diagnosis: acute liver failure. The organ, weakened by a lifetime and battered by recent trauma, was shutting down. The news struck Mark with the force of a physical blow. He was at the county jail awaiting transfer to a rehab facility when Robert's head of security, David, came to tell him. The guilt that had been a constant gnawing presence in his gut now became a ravenous beast, consuming him. He had done this. His actions had directly led his mother to this sterile, beeping brink of death. He begged, pleaded, and was eventually granted a heavily guarded furlough to be tested as a potential living donor. It was his chance, his only chance, to undo a fraction of the harm he had caused. He clung to the possibility with the desperation of a drowning man. But the universe, it seemed, had no more mercy for him. The battery of tests revealed a harsh truth. Years of using alcohol to numb his failures and anxieties had scarred his own liver. It was fatty, inflamed, and utterly unsuitable for transplantation. The doctor's words, delivered with clinical gentleness, shattered him. "I'm sorry, Mr. Vance. You are not a viable candidate." He was forced to confront the ultimate consequence of his self-destruction. He was powerless to save the one person he had already hurt so profoundly. He crumpled into a chair in the waiting room, his head in his hands, weeping silent tears of utter futility. He was not just a failure. He was a condemned man watching his mother die because of the poison he had chosen to feed himself. Robert watched this scene of abject despair from across the room. He had been a pillar throughout, coordinating with the best medical minds in the country, his wealth ensuring Eleanor had every possible advantage. But medicine had its limits, and the national organ transplant list was a cruel lottery with time running out. Seeing Mark's complete and total devastation and the pale, still form of Eleanor in the ICU, something in him shifted. It wasn't a calculated decision, not a strategic move. It was an instinct, a primal, unwavering certainty. He stood up, walked calmly to the nurse's station, and spoke to the transplant coordinator. "Test me." The coordinator, a weary-looking woman named Brenda, glanced up. "Mr. Vance, while that's a noble offer, the chances of a direct match, even with a relative, are statistically—" "Test me," Robert repeated, his voice quiet but leaving no room for argument. "Please." The process began with a blood draw, the first of many tests. Robert went through them with a detached focus, a CEO overseeing the most important merger of his life. He didn't allow himself to hope. He simply willed it to be so. He thought of his own mother, of the helplessness he'd felt watching her slip away from an illness money couldn't cure. He would not feel that helplessness again. Hours later, the head of the transplant team, Dr. Isabella Alvarez, entered the private family room where Robert and a shattered Mark were waiting. Her expression was one of profound, almost disbelief. "Mr. Vance," she began, looking directly at Robert, "I've been doing this for 20 years. I have never seen anything like it. The compatibility markers, they're a perfect match. Not just good, perfect. It's as if you were genetically engineered to be her donor." The air left the room. Mark stared, his jaw slack, a confusing maelstrom of hope, shame, and awe swirling in his eyes. He had been rendered useless by his own vices, and now a virtual stranger, a man he had taken to court and slandered in the press, was stepping into the void he had created. Robert didn't hesitate. He didn't look at Mark for approval or gratitude. He simply nodded at Dr. Alvarez. "Schedule the surgery." The following hours were a blur of preoperative procedures. Robert was prepped for surgery in a room down the hall from Eleanor. As orderlies were about to wheel him away, Mark approached, his guard hovering nearby. He looked broken, humbled to his very core. "Why?" Mark whispered, the single word laden with a lifetime of confusion and self-loathing. "After everything I did, why would you do this?" Robert met his gaze, his own eyes clear and resolute. "Because she forgave you," he said simply, "and because it's the right thing to do." There was no grand speech, no condemnation. It was a statement of fact, more powerful than any lecture. As he was wheeled into the bright antiseptic glare of the operating room, the gravity of the moment settled upon him. He was giving a part of his literal self to save her. The anesthesia began to take hold, a cold sensation creeping up his arm. His last conscious thought was not of his billions, his companies, or his legacy. It was of Eleanor's face on the mountain, and the quiet, unshakable strength he had seen in her eyes when she forgave her son. Then the world faded to black, and the long, uncertain vigil began. The surgery was a success, the transplanted lobe settling into its new home within Eleanor's body. But in the delicate and dangerous post-operative period, as both donor and recipient fought to heal, a new threat was already moving. The criminal network whose ledger Eleanor possessed, having learned of her location and her fragile state, saw an opportunity. With Robert incapacitated and security necessarily focused on the hospital, they prepared to make their move, believing the secret of their operations was just one vulnerable, recovering old woman away from being erased forever. The first thing Eleanor was aware of was the light, not the harsh, unforgiving glare of the mountain night, but a soft, diffused glow. Then came the sounds, the steady, rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor, the hushed whir of a ventilator, the muffled footsteps of nurses in the hall. Pain was a distant, muffled throb, held at bay by a cocktail of medications. She was in the ICU. She was alive. Her eyelids felt heavy as stone, but she forced them open, blinking against the blurriness. The world swam into focus slowly. To her left, slumped in an uncomfortable-looking vinyl chair, was Mark, His face was pale and drawn, shadowed with a stubble that was more neglect than style. But in his sleep, the lines of perpetual calculation and anxiety had smoothed out, leaving behind the ghost of the boy he used to be. One of his hands was resting on the bed rail, inches from her own. To her right, in an identical chair, was Robert. He looked exhausted, his expensive shirt wrinkled, his usually impeccable hair disheveled. A large, sterile bandage was visible beneath the open collar of his shirt, a stark white testament to the piece of himself he had given her. His eyes were closed, but his brow was furrowed even in rest, as if he were still willing her to heal through sheer force of will. A warmth spread through Eleanor's chest, a feeling so profound it momentarily eclipsed the physical discomfort. It wasn't the heat of the hospital blankets or the IV fluids. It was the warmth of a love she had thought lost to her forever. Here in this sterile room, flanked by these two broken, beautiful men, she was home. She moved her hand, a slow, deliberate effort that felt like lifting a great weight. She laid it gently on top of Mark's. His eyes fluttered open instantly, red-rimmed and wide with a mixture of fear and hope. "Mom?" he whispered, his voice cracking. The sound stirred Robert. He woke with a start, his CEO's reflexes kicking in before his gaze landed on her and softened into pure, unguarded relief. "Eleanor," he breathed, leaning forward. "You're awake." She looked from one face to the other. Her son, who had fallen so far but had clawed his way back to her side through a storm of his own making. And the man who was a stranger no longer, who had given her not just safety and comfort, but a literal part of his own body, asking for nothing in return. The last vestiges of the old, quiet life in her Asheville bungalow fell away, and in its place, something new and unbreakable was forged in the crucible of shared suffering and sacrifice. Summoning every ounce of her strength, Eleanor managed a weak but radiant smile. Slowly, she moved her other hand and placed it over Robert's where it rested on the bed. She looked at Mark, then at Robert, her eyes shining with tears that held no sorrow, only a boundless, grateful love. "My boys," she whispered, her voice a dry, raspy thread of sound, but imbued with a power that filled the entire room. The words hung in the air, a sacred benediction. Mark's shoulders shook with a silent sob, but he didn't look away. He turned his hand under hers and clasped it tightly. Robert, the billionaire who commanded boardrooms, found his own vision blurring with tears. He covered her small, frail hand with his other one, completing the circle. In that moment, they were no longer a victim, a villain, and a savior. They were a family, bound not by blood, but by something far stronger, by forgiveness, by sacrifice, and by a shared, unspoken vow to protect this fragile new beginning they had carved from the wreckage of the past. The beeping of the heart monitor seemed to steady, becoming a strong, confident rhythm, a soundtrack to a second chance for all of them. Yet even as this profound peace settled over the hospital room, a different kind of activity was stirring in the world outside. The criminal network, whose secrets were meticulously detailed in the small black ledger now locked in a safe in Robert's Seattle headquarters, had not been idle. They had watched the very public drama unfold. They knew Eleanor Vance had survived. They knew Robert Vance had protected her. And they knew that a secret of that magnitude would not remain hidden forever. With Robert temporarily vulnerable and their operations at risk of exposure, they were finalizing a plan to silence the only loose end they couldn't afford, the old woman who had, against all odds, lived to tell the tale. The quiet that returned to their lives was no longer the heavy, waiting silence of before, but a peaceful, earned calm. Eleanor's recovery was slow but steady, a testament to her own resilience and the flawless compatibility of the organ she now carried. Mark, true to his court-mandated path and his own hard-won resolve, completed his inpatient treatment with a focus that surprised even himself. He emerged not cured, he knew the battle would be lifelong, but armed with tools and a humility he'd never possessed. He took a job as a groundskeeper at a local public golf course, the simple physical labor a form of daily penance and peace. Robert, however, was a man transformed. The experience had sanded away the last sharp edges of the ruthless billionaire. The plot of land in Asheville, once intended as the site for a monument to his grief and his wealth, now felt like a hollow pursuit. He stood there one crisp autumn morning, the same spot where he had first conceived of the Eleanor Vance Center for Rare Neurological Diseases, and saw a different future entirely. He didn't see a sterile, exclusive institute named for a memory. He saw the dappled sunlight filtering through the poplars, the same light that had guided Eleanor on her terrible night. He saw a place for life, not just the study of its end. He summoned his architects and lawyers not to discuss blueprints for a resort, but to draft plans for a gift. A year later, under a sky as clear and blue as a robin's egg, the community of Asheville gathered for the inauguration. There was no ribbon of red velvet, but a simple, rustic archway made of reclaimed timber. A sign, carved from local stone, read, "The Eleanor Vance Park and Community Health Center." It was not one, but two gifts to the town. On one side, sprawling across the gentle foothills, was a public park. There were walking trails that meandered through the woods, not as a threat, but as a sanctuary. There were picnic areas, a playground echoing with the laughter of children, and quiet benches overlooking the same mountain vista that had watched over Eleanor for 72 years. It was a place of peace, freely given to all. And nestled at the park's entrance, built with the same craftsman-style elegance as Eleanor's old bungalow, was the health center. It was a small but state-of-the-art facility offering free medical and dental care to the county's seniors and underprivileged children. Robert had personally endowed it to ensure its doors would never close. It was his promise made tangible. No one would be abandoned. No one would be alone. As the mayor gave a speech, Robert stood back, his hand resting gently on Eleanor's shoulder. Mark stood on her other side, his posture straight, his eyes clear. They watched as the townspeople, their faces filled with gratitude and curiosity, streamed into the park. This was their legacy, not of money, but of mercy. It was the answer to the darkness they had collectively faced. Eleanor, her hand resting lightly on the stone sign that bore her name, looked out at the playing children and the strolling elderly couples. Her heart felt too large for her chest. The mountains no longer felt distant. They felt like gentle guardians of this new, beautiful thing they had built from the ashes of betrayal. Robert had not just saved her life, he had helped her build a new one, and in doing so, had found his own true purpose. Yet, as the celebratory barbecue smoke curled into the air and the local bluegrass band began to play, Robert's head of security, David, moved through the crowd with a quiet intensity. He leaned in close to Robert, his voice low. "We've finished the full decryption of the ledger," he murmured. "It's worse than we thought. The network is extensive, and the primary players, they're not local thugs. They're based in Miami, and they've just been linked to a high-profile disappearance. They know the ledger is compromised, and the forensic accountant we hired believes they've identified a transaction that could only have come from someone with access to our initial investigation." The idyllic peace of the afternoon suddenly felt paper-thin, the threat no longer a vague shadow, but a predator with a name and a location, and a very compelling reason to silence anyone connected to the little black book. The air in Asheville was different now, a year later. It still carried the specific quiet of the mountains, but it was no longer a silence that settled in the bones with a chill. Today it was a hush of anticipation, filled with the scent of cut grass and blooming rhododendrons. The sun, warm and forgiving, bathed the crowd gathered at the entrance to the new park. Eleanor Vance stood between her son and the man who had become her second son, her heart feeling so full she thought it might bloom right out of her chest. She was radiant, the sallowness of illness replaced by a healthy glow, her eyes bright and clear. The simple, elegant dress she wore was a far cry from the thin cardigan of that terrible night. She looked at the rustic archway and the stone sign carved with her name, the Eleanor Vance Park and Community Health Center. To her left stood Mark. A year of sobriety and hard, honest work had sculpted a new man. The lines of strain and calculation had softened. His hands, once restless with the need for a drink or a dice roll, were now calloused and steady from his work as a groundskeeper, and more recently, as a peer counselor at the very health center that bore his mother's name. He used his story, his painful public fall, to help others find their footing. He caught his mother's eye and gave her a small, genuine smile. one that reached his eyes. It was a smile of peace, hard-won and cherished. To her right was Robert. The billionaire's armor was gone, replaced by a quiet contentment that suited him far better. The relentless drive that had built an empire had been channeled into building this, a sanctuary of healing and community. His gaze swept over the park, the winding trails that invited peaceful strolls, the playground echoing with the shrieks of joyful children, the benches facing the gentle, hazy fortress of the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was the absolute antithesis of abandonment. It was a promise, carved into the land itself. The mayor finished his speech, and the crowd applauded. Then it was their turn. Robert handed Eleanor a large pair of ceremonial scissors. Her hands, once weak and trembling, were now steady. But she didn't take them alone. She looked at Mark, then at Robert, and nodded. They each placed a hand on the scissors with hers, a triad of shared history and redemption. Together they cut the wide blue ribbon. The snap of the fabric was met with a wave of cheers, the sound rolling through the trees and up toward the peaks. As the ribbon fluttered to the ground, they turned to each other. The embrace was natural, inevitable. Eleanor wrapped her arms around Mark, feeling the solid, reliable strength in his frame, so different from the desperate, hollow man he had been. Then she turned to Robert, pulling him close, this stranger who had become her family, her savior in more ways than one. He held her gently, mindful of the scar they now shared, a permanent, physical bond. Then Mark and Robert clasped hands, a firm, respectful grip that spoke volumes of forgiveness and a shared purpose. They stood there, the three of them, an unconventional family bound not by blood, but by something more powerful, by sacrifice, by forgiveness, and by a love that had refused to be extinguished. The crowd began to stream past them into the park. Families spread out blankets, children raced toward the playground, and elderly couples began a slow, steady walk down the main trail. From the health center, the gentle hum of activity was a sound of hope. Robert had ensured it would be a permanent fixture, a place where no one would be turned away. It was his atonement for a past he couldn't change, and his investment in a future they were building together. Eleanor watched it all, her arm linked through Mark's, Robert standing protectively at her other side. The mountains that had once felt like watching, indifferent giants now felt like gentle guardians. This land, which had witnessed her deepest terror, now held her greatest joy. They had taken the poison of abandonment, addiction, and greed and had alchemized it into something pure and good. The past was not forgotten, but it had lost its power to wound. They had healed, each of them, and in healing each other, they had built a new world. Yet, as the bluegrass band struck up a lively tune and the scent of barbecue filled the air, Robert's phone vibrated in his pocket. He glanced at it discreetly. It was a message from David, his head of security. The text was brief, a request to call at his earliest convenience regarding a final disposition of the Miami matter. The ledger's shadow, though fading, had not been entirely banished. The peace they had built was real and strong, but the world outside their beautiful, handmade sanctuary still held the echoes of the darkness they had faced, a reminder that some stories, even the happiest ones, have threads that are never fully tied off.